When I turned 70, I cooked dinner for 8 people, and not a single chair was filled. I set the table the way I always had, with my best china, the one with the delicate blue trim I only brought out for holidays and birthdays, and I made sure each plate was aligned just right, the silverware polished until it reflected the soft glow of the dining room light, the kind of detail that used to matter to my family, or at least I thought it did. The turkey had been in the oven since noon, slow roasted the way Daniel used to love when he was a boy, the skin crisp and golden, the smell filling every corner of the house, wrapping around me like a memory I wasn't ready to let go of. I made mashed potatoes from scratch, not the box kind, with real butter and cream, and green beans sautéed with garlic, just the way Sophia once said reminded her of her grandmother's cooking, back when she still spoke to me like I belonged. I even baked the apple pie myself, peeling each apple carefully, slicing them thin, sprinkling cinnamon the way my husband used to prefer before he passed, because some habits don't leave you, even when the person is gone. I checked the clock at 5:55 p.m., 5 minutes before dinner, smoothing the front of my dress, a soft lavender one I had picked out weeks ago. Something simple but elegant, something that made me feel like I was still part of something. At 6 p.m. I lit the candles. At 6:10 I checked my phone. No messages. At 6:20 I told myself traffic in the city could be unpredictable, that maybe Daniel had been held up at work, that Sophia was probably managing the kids, that any minute now I would hear the familiar sound of the front door opening, voices filling the silence that had started to press in around me. At 6:45 the candles had burned halfway down. The food was still warm, but not the way it should be. I picked up my phone again, my fingers hovering over Daniel's name, but I didn't call. I didn't want to seem impatient. I didn't want to be that mother. At 7:05 I sat down at the head of the table, just for a moment, just to rest my feet, telling myself I would stand up again as soon as I heard them arrive. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, just empty. I looked at the 8 place settings, each one carefully arranged, each one waiting for someone who wasn't there. I reached for my water glass, took a small sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been, as if keeping everything in place might somehow make the evening unfold the way I had imagined. Then, without thinking, I opened my phone again, not to call this time, just to distract myself, just to pass a minute or two, and that's when I saw it. A photo. Bright sunlight. Blue water stretching out behind them. Daniel standing with his arm around Sophia, both of them smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The kids in front of them laughing, holding colorful drinks with little paper umbrellas. The caption read, "Family getaway. Much needed time together." I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing each face, each detail, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. This wasn't a work delay. This wasn't traffic. This was a beach, somewhere warm, somewhere far away from the dining room I was sitting in, from the meal I had spent all day preparing. I scrolled to the next photo. And the next. Different angles. Same smiles. Same sun. Same word repeated in the comments below. Beautiful family. I didn't see my name anywhere. I didn't see a missed call. I didn't see a message saying they couldn't make it. Just pictures. I set the phone down slowly, my movements careful, controlled, as if any sudden motion might shatter something I couldn't afford to lose completely. The candles flickered softly, the only movement in the room, their light dancing across the empty chairs, across the plates that would not be used, across a table that had been set for a family that had chosen to be somewhere else. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead, not at the food, not at the door, just at the space in front of me, and for the first time that evening, a thought settled in, quiet but certain. They hadn't forgotten. They had made a decision, and I had not been part of it. I did not touch the food right away. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the steam to disappear from the mashed potatoes, long enough for the golden skin on the turkey to lose its shine and settle into something dull and forgotten, long enough for the house to feel like it no longer belonged to the version of my life I had been holding on to. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second louder than the last, filling the space where voices should have been, where laughter should have echoed the way it used to when Daniel was younger and birthdays meant something more than a date on a calendar. I reached forward eventually, not out of hunger but out of habit, and adjusted a fork that had shifted slightly out of place, aligning it again with quiet precision, because it felt like the only thing I still had control over. My phone remained on the table beside me, screen dark now, but I could still see the images in my mind, The bright blue ocean, the wide smiles, the easy way they stood together as if nothing was missing, as if no one had been left behind. I wondered briefly how long they had known about the trip, how many conversations had happened that did not include me, how many plans had been made while I was here, thinking about recipes, making grocery lists, choosing a dress. The thought did not come with anger. Not yet, just a quiet realization that settled deeper the longer I sat with it. This had not been last minute. This had been organized, scheduled, agreed upon. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen, my steps steady, my hands calm, and I turned off the oven light even though the oven itself had already cooled. The small action felt symbolic in a way I could not fully explain, like closing a door that had been left open for too long. I found containers in the cabinet, the plastic ones I used for leftovers, and began to transfer the food one dish at a time, careful, methodical, as if I were preparing for a routine evening instead of quietly dismantling something I had spent all day building. The turkey was heavier now, not in weight but in meaning, each slice placed into a container with the same attention I had given it hours earlier, except now there was no anticipation attached to it, no expectation of shared plates or second helpings or someone asking for the recipe. I moved to the mashed potatoes next, smoothing the top before placing the lid on. A small gesture of care that felt almost automatic, like muscle memory from years of doing the same thing for people who once noticed. When everything was packed away, I wiped down the counters, rinsed the dishes that had never been used, and turned off the dining room light, leaving the candles to burn out on their own. I did not rush. There was no need to rush. Time had already proven it was not waiting for anyone. As I walked back into the dining room one last time, I paused and looked at the table again, at the 8 chairs that had remained empty from beginning to end, and I tried to remember the last time all of them had been filled at once, the last time no one had been distracted, no one had been checking their phone, no one had been somewhere else even while sitting right in front of me. The memory felt distant, like something I had read about rather than lived. I picked up my phone again, this time not to scroll, not to search for answers, but simply to check if anything had changed, if perhaps a message had come through while I was in the kitchen, some explanation, some acknowledgement, even something small. There was nothing. No missed calls. No texts. No apology waiting quietly to be read. Just silence. The same silence that had stretched across the evening from the moment I lit the candles to the moment they burned down to nothing. I set the phone back down and walked upstairs, each step measured, my hand brushing lightly against the banister polished smooth over decades of use. The house creaked softly, familiar sounds that once felt comforting now carrying a different weight, as if they were echoing something back to me that I had not been willing to hear before. When I reached my bedroom, I did not turn on the light immediately. I stood there in the doorway, letting the darkness settle around me, letting my eyes adjust, letting the quiet sink in fully without interruption. There is a difference between being alone and being excluded, and that night I understood it completely for the first time. Alone is something you can choose. This was not a choice. This was something that had been decided for me, somewhere far away, under a bright sky and a warm sun, while I stood in my kitchen measuring flour and setting plates. I sat down on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, just as I had done at the table, and I realized that nothing about this evening had been accidental. Not the timing. Not the silence. Not the absence. It was all too precise, too complete, too clean. And that was when the question finally came, not loud, not desperate, just clear. If they could plan something like this without me, what else had they already planned that I did not know about? Sleep did not come easily that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind had become too quiet in a way that made everything sharper, every detail from the past few months stepping forward one by one as if they had been waiting for me to finally notice them. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my hands resting lightly on top of the blanket, and I began to replay conversations I had not thought twice about before. Small things, simple things, moments that seemed harmless at the time but now felt different when placed next to what had just happened. I remembered calling Daniel 3 weeks ago, asking what time I should have dinner ready for my birthday, and there had been a pause just a second too long before he answered, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, saying, "We will figure it out, Mom, do not worry about it." At the time I told myself he was busy, that work had been demanding, that adulthood comes with responsibilities that do not always leave room for immediate answers, but now that pause felt like something else, like a gap where the truth had been deliberately left out. I remembered Sophia stopping by the house the following week, standing in my kitchen with her phone in her hand, glancing down at it more often than she looked at me, Her smile polite but distant, and when I mentioned the birthday dinner again she had said, "That sounds nice," in a tone that did not match the words, a tone I could not quite place then but I could now. It was the tone of someone acknowledging something they had no intention of attending. I remembered offering to make her favorite dessert, the lemon bar she once asked me to bring to every holiday gathering, and she had waved it off lightly, saying they were trying to cut back on sugar, even though I had seen photos just days later of her holding a large slice of cake at a restaurant, laughing with friends. At the time I brushed it aside because it seemed too small to question, too insignificant to challenge, but now each of those moments lined up neatly, forming something that was no longer easy to ignore. I turned onto my side, facing the window, watching the faint glow of the streetlight outside cast a soft shadow across the floor, and I realized that this had not started with a single dinner or a single missed event. It had been happening slowly, quietly, over time. A series of small exclusions that had been easy to explain away individually but impossible to dismiss when seen together. There were birthdays where I had been told the celebration was low-key, only to later see pictures of a full party. There were school events for the children where I had been given the wrong time, arriving just as everything was ending, greeted with surprised expressions and quick explanations that never quite added up. There were holidays where plans had changed at the last minute, always in a way that left me on the outside, always with a reason that sounded reasonable enough to accept in the moment. I had accepted all of it not because I did not see it, but because I did not want to believe what it meant. It is easier to assume confusion than intention. It is easier to believe in mistakes than patterns. But lying there in the quiet with nothing left to distract me, I could no longer separate one from the other. I sat up slowly, the movement deliberate, and reached for the glass of water on my nightstand, taking a small sip before setting it back down, the simple act grounding me in a way that felt necessary. My house had always been a place of consistency, a place where things made sense, where routines held meaning, where family had a clear shape and a clear center. But something about that shape had changed, and I had not noticed when it happened, only that I was no longer at the center of it. I was somewhere on the edge now, included when it was convenient, excluded when it was not, informed only when it did not interfere with plans that had already been made without me. The realization did not come with tears. It did not come with anger. It came with clarity, steady and undeniable, like a light being turned on in a room I had been walking through in the dark. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just slightly, looking out at the quiet street, the empty sidewalk, the stillness of everything beyond my home. Somewhere far away my family was laughing, sharing meals, taking pictures, creating memories that I had not been invited to be part of, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider that it was not an oversight. It was a decision, and decisions once made tend to repeat themselves unless something changes. By morning everything in the house looked exactly the same, but it no longer felt the same, and that difference was not something I could ignore anymore. I moved through my usual routine quietly, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early light settle into the rooms that had once held so much noise, so much movement, so much life that I never thought to question whether it could all disappear in such a quiet, deliberate way. I poured myself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, not the dining room, not that table, because something about it now felt distant, like it belonged to a version of my life that had already ended without me noticing. I wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling the warmth against my fingers, and I let my mind drift back further than the past few months, further than the small signs I had ignored, back to the years when everything had felt certain, when my role in the family had been clear and unquestioned. I thought about Daniel as a child, how he used to run into the kitchen after school, dropping his backpack by the door, asking what was for dinner before he even said hello, how he would sit at that same table and tell me about his day, about his teachers, about the smallest details that felt important to him then, and how I listened to every word as if it mattered because it did. I thought about the nights I stayed up late helping him with homework, the mornings I woke up early to pack his lunches, the weekends spent driving him to practices, to games, to anything that made him happy, because that was what being a mother meant to me, being present, being reliable, being the person he could always count on without question. And then I thought about the years after he grew up, after he met Sophia, after the rhythm of our lives shifted in ways that felt natural at first because change is expected, because children grow up and build their own families, and I told myself that stepping back was part of that process, that giving them space was a sign of respect, not distance. When they bought their first house, I was there every weekend helping paint the walls, bringing over meals, making sure they had everything they needed to start their life together. And I remember how Sophia smiled at me then, how she thanked me, how she told people I was such a blessing. Words that felt genuine at the time, words I held on to as proof that I still belonged. When the children were born, I became the one they called when they needed help, the one who showed up without hesitation, who rearranged her own schedule to fit theirs, who learned their routines, their preferences, their little habits, because I wanted to make things easier for them, because I believed that was what family was supposed to do for each other. I did not keep track of how many hours I spent, how many meals I cooked, how many times I said yes without asking for anything in return, because it never felt like something that needed to be counted. It was just part of who I was. But sitting there that morning with the coffee growing cooler in my hands, I began to see those years differently, not as mistakes, not as something I regretted, but as something that had been quietly redefined over time. What I had seen as support, they may have seen as expectation. What I had offered freely, they may have come to assume would always be there. Always available, always convenient. And when something becomes expected, it stops being valued in the same way. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, past the framed photos on the walls, each one capturing a moment that had once felt permanent, birthdays, holidays, vacations, all of us together, smiling in a way that seemed effortless, natural, real. I paused in front of one photo in particular, taken years ago at the beach, Daniel standing beside me, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember, but the feeling of that moment still lingered, a sense of closeness that felt undeniable then. I reached up and straightened the frame slightly, even though it was already straight, and I wondered when that closeness had begun to shift, when the easy connection had been replaced by something more distant, more controlled, more selective. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It happens gradually, in small decisions, in subtle changes, in moments that seem too minor to question until they form something larger than you can ignore. I walked back into the kitchen and rinsed out my coffee cup, setting it carefully in the sink, and I realized that the life I had been holding on to was not taken from me in a single moment. It had been adjusted, reshaped, and slowly moved forward without me, until I was no longer part of the version they were building. And the hardest part was not that they had changed. It was that I had not allowed myself to see it when it started. Later that afternoon, as the light shifted and settled more softly across the kitchen floor, my phone finally rang, and for a brief moment, I let it ring longer than I normally would, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to understand what I felt before I answered it. The name on the screen was Daniel, and seeing it there did not bring relief the way it used to, it brought something quieter, something measured. I picked up on the fourth ring, my voice steady, calm, exactly as it had always been. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone light, almost casual, as if nothing had happened, as if the night before had been ordinary, forgettable. I did not respond right away, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted to hear what he would say next without interruption. "Sorry we missed dinner," he added quickly, the words coming a little too easily, a little too practiced. "Things got a little hectic and we ended up taking a last-minute trip." I stood there by the counter, one hand resting lightly against the edge, and I looked out the window as he spoke, watching a car pass slowly down the street, the world continuing in its usual rhythm while something inside mine had shifted completely. "A last-minute trip," I repeated quietly, not as a question, not even as a challenge, just as an acknowledgement of what he had chosen to say. "Yeah," he replied. "It was something Sophia planned, kind of a surprise for everyone. You know how she is." There was a small pause after that, one that felt familiar now, and I could almost hear him waiting for me to fill it, to reassure him, to make it easier, the way I had done so many times before without even realizing it. But I did not fill it. I let the silence stay where it was. "We will celebrate when we get back," he continued, his voice shifting slightly, becoming more careful. "We can do something nice, just us." I turned slightly, leaning back against the counter now, and I let his words settle, not just the meaning but the way they were offered, as if the timing did not matter, as if the moment itself could be moved, replaced, adjusted to fit their schedule. "You already did something nice," I said finally, my tone even, not sharp, not emotional, just clear. He laughed lightly, uncertain, as if he was not sure how to respond to that, as if he could sense something had changed but could not yet define it. "Mom, come on, it was just a trip," he said, trying to keep it simple, trying to keep it small. "For everyone," I added, still calm, still steady. Another pause. This one longer. "We thought you might not want to travel," he said after a moment, and there it was, a new explanation, one that had not been mentioned before, one that appeared quickly, conveniently, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface, ready to be used if needed. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me, and I realized that the details did not matter as much as the pattern did. The reasons could change. The explanations could shift. But the outcome remained the same. "I see," I said, and I meant it, not in the way he might have expected, not as acceptance but as understanding. There was a difference, and for the first time I felt it clearly. "Are you okay?" he asked then, and his voice softened slightly, not with concern, but with something closer to obligation, the kind of question you ask because you know you should. I looked around the kitchen at the clean counters, the empty sink, the quiet order of everything, and I considered the question carefully. "I am," I replied, and that was true, just not in the way it used to be. He hesitated again, and I could tell he was searching for something to say, something to restore the balance he was used to, something that would return us to the roles we had always played. "We will call you later," he said finally, settling on something safe, something non-committal. "Enjoy your trip," I answered, and when I said it, I realized I meant that too. Not because I was excusing what had happened, but because I was no longer trying to fit myself into something that did not include me. We said goodbye, the call ended, and I set the phone down gently on the counter, the same way I had the night before, my movements controlled, deliberate. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, not empty in the same way, not waiting for something to happen, but settled still, as if it had accepted something that I was only just beginning to understand. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my thoughts clear in a way they had not been before. It is one thing to be left out without explanation. It is another to be given explanations that do not hold. And once you recognize that difference, it becomes very difficult to go back to the way things were. The next day, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I opened the drawer in the hallway where I kept all the documents I rarely needed but never threw away, papers that marked decisions, agreements, responsibilities, that had shaped my life quietly over the years. I pulled out a folder, the one labeled in my own handwriting, neat and careful, and I carried it to the dining room table, the same table that had been set for 8 just a day before. I sat down slowly, placing the folder in front of me, and for a moment I simply looked at it, not opening it yet, just acknowledging what it represented. Inside were copies of the house deed, the original mortgage documents, the refinances I had handled on my own after my husband passed, and a separate section that held records of financial help I had given Daniel over the years, not because I was keeping score, but because I had always believed in being organized, in knowing where things stood, in making sure nothing would become a burden later. I opened the folder carefully, flipping through the pages one by one, not rushing, letting each document come into view with the same clarity I had begun to feel in my thoughts. There were records of the down payment I had contributed when Daniel and Sophia bought their first home, a significant amount transferred quietly without ceremony, because I had wanted them to start strong, to have stability, to build something of their own. There were checks written over the years for school tuition for the children, small notes attached sometimes, wishing them a good semester, encouraging them to do their best, reminders that they were supported. There were expenses I had covered when Daniel's work had slowed down 1 year, when things had been uncertain and he had come to me, not asking directly, but hinting in a way I understood without needing it to be said. I had never questioned those moments. I had never set conditions. I had simply helped because that was what I believed family meant. I paused on one document, a more recent one, detailing a monthly transfer I had set up to assist with childcare costs, something Sophia had once mentioned was becoming overwhelming. I remembered that conversation clearly now, the way she had sat across from me at this very table, explaining how difficult it was to balance everything, how expensive things had become, how much pressure they were under. I had listened, nodded, and told her not to worry, that I would take care of it, and I had meant it without hesitation. But sitting there now, looking at the numbers printed clearly on the page, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. None of these things had been hidden. None of them had been insignificant. They were part of the foundation of their lives, woven into their stability in ways that were real, measurable, undeniable. And yet, when it came time to decide who would be included, who would be remembered, who would be invited, none of that had seemed to matter. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it, not with regret, but with a new kind of awareness, one that felt steady, grounded, and impossible to ignore. It was not about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about value, about recognition, about understanding where I stood in the structure of the family I had spent my life supporting. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same quiet street, the same passing cars, the same ordinary movement of the day, and I realized that for years, I had been participating in something that had slowly shifted without my consent, without my full awareness, until I found myself on the outside of decisions that directly involved me. I had assumed that my presence was understood, that my role was secure, that my place was permanent. But permanence requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires intention. Without it, things change, sometimes quietly, sometimes completely. I turned back toward the table and picked up the folder again, holding it more firmly this time, not as a reminder of what I had given, but as a reflection of what had been built, and who had been responsible for building it. There is a difference between giving freely and being taken for granted, and that difference had become very clear. I walked to the hallway and placed the folder back in the drawer, closing it with a soft but decisive motion, and as I did, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. If they could plan a life that did not include me, then I could begin to plan mine with the same clarity, the same intention, the same quiet certainty that I had always given to them. 2 days later, I made an appointment, not because I was upset, not because I wanted to confront anyone, but because I understood that clarity requires action, and action requires structure. I dressed the same way I always did when I had something important to take care of, simple, composed, nothing that called attention, but everything in place, as if the outside needed to reflect the order I was beginning to establish inside. The office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that feels intentional, where every sound is softened, every movement measured, and I checked in at the front desk before taking a seat near the window, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I had not told Daniel about the appointment. There was no reason to. This was not something that required discussion, not yet, not until I understood everything fully for myself. When my name was called, I stood and followed the assistant down a short hallway into a room that felt both professional and familiar, shelves lined with binders, a desk cleared except for a few organized stacks of paper, everything in its place. The attorney greeted me with a polite smile, extending his hand, and I returned it calmly, introducing myself in the same steady tone I had used for years, the tone that had carried me through every responsibility I had ever taken on. We sat across from each other, and he asked how he could help, his voice neutral, open, leaving space for whatever I needed to say. I did not rush into it. I placed my purse on the chair beside me, opened it, and took out the folder I had reviewed the day before, setting it gently on the desk between us. I would like to review my estate plan, I said, my words clear, deliberate, without hesitation. He nodded, reaching for a notepad, and began asking the standard questions about assets, about beneficiaries, about any existing arrangements that needed to be updated. I answered each one carefully, not from memory alone, but from understanding, because this was not the first time I had handled these matters, just the first time I was approaching them from a different perspective. As we spoke, I realized how much of my planning in the past had been built around assumptions that my role in the family would remain unchanged, that the relationships I had relied on would continue to hold the same meaning, the same value. But assumptions, I was beginning to see, are not guarantees. They are placeholders, and placeholders can be replaced. The attorney reviewed the documents I had brought, flipping through them with a practiced eye, occasionally pausing to ask a clarifying question, occasionally making a note. "Everything here is in good order," he said after a few minutes, "but it can certainly be adjusted if your circumstances or preferences have changed." I nodded slightly, letting that statement settle because it was simple, but it carried weight. Preferences have changed. Circumstances have changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily enough that ignoring it would no longer make sense. "I would like to make some revisions," I said, and as I spoke, I felt something shift again. Not emotionally, but structurally, like aligning something that had been slightly off for too long. We discussed options, not in abstract terms but in specific practical steps, how assets could be reassigned, how provisions could be structured, how certain decisions could be documented clearly to avoid confusion later. There was no tension in the room, no urgency, just a calm, methodical process, the kind I had always trusted when it came to important matters. When the meeting ended, I thanked him, gathered my things, and walked back through the quiet hallway, past the front desk, and out into the afternoon light. The air felt different outside, not because anything had changed in the world, but because something had been clarified within it. I stood there for a moment, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder, and I realized that for the first time since my birthday, I was not reacting to what had happened. I was responding to it. There is a difference between those two things, and that difference defines what comes next. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my thoughts steady, organized, no longer circling the same questions, but moving forward with intention. Whatever came after this would not be based on what I had hoped for, or what I had assumed, but on what I now understood clearly, without doubt, without hesitation. They returned 3 days later, just as I had expected they would, not because I had been waiting, but because patterns tend to repeat themselves when nothing interrupts them. I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway in the early afternoon, followed by the familiar rhythm of doors closing, voices overlapping, laughter carrying through the air with an ease that suggested nothing had been disrupted, nothing had shifted. I remained in the living room, seated in my usual chair, a book open in my hands, though I had not turned the page in several minutes. The front door opened and I could hear the children first, their voices bright, excited, talking over each other about something I could not quite make out, followed by Sophia's tone, warm and animated, and then Daniel's steady, relaxed, as if they were returning from something entirely ordinary. "Mom, we are back," he called out, his voice carrying down the hallway, and I closed the book gently, placing it on the table beside me before standing up. I walked toward the entryway at a measured pace, not rushing, not delaying, simply arriving at the moment as it presented itself. They stood there with bags still in their hands, the children moving past them into the house, already heading toward the kitchen, already asking about snacks, about what was available, about what had been missed. Sophia smiled when she saw me, a practiced expression that appeared easily, confidently, as if nothing required explanation beyond what had already been said. "We brought you something," she said, holding up a small bag, the kind you find in gift shops, light, colorful, easy to carry. I looked at it briefly, then back at her, and I nodded once. "That was thoughtful," I said, my tone even polite, exactly as it had always been. Daniel stepped forward then, setting his own bag down near the door, and he reached out as if to embrace me, a gesture that felt familiar but slightly delayed, as if it had been remembered rather than felt. I allowed it, but only briefly, stepping back with the same quiet composure I had carried through the past few days. "How was the trip?" I asked, not because I needed to know, but because it was the question expected in this moment. "It was great," he said quickly, a little too quickly, and he began describing the beach, the weather, the hotel, details that came easily, details that had been shared already in photos, in captions, in moments I had observed from a distance. I listened without interrupting, my attention steady, my expression unchanged, and when he finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites a response, a reaction, something that would confirm everything was as it had always been. But I did not offer that confirmation. Instead, I turned slightly toward the dining room. "I have something I would like to discuss," I said, my voice calm, clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The shift was subtle, but it was immediate. Sophia's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, more carefully this time, and Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back at me, as if trying to read something that was no longer as familiar as it once had been. We moved into the dining room together, the same room where the table had been set days before, though now it was clear, orderly, without the weight of expectation attached to it. I gestured for them to sit, and I remained standing for a moment longer before taking my place at the head of the table, not out of habit, but out of intention. I folded my hands in front of me, just as I had done before, and I looked at them both, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. "I have made some changes," I said, my words measured, precise, each one placed carefully, "to my financial arrangements and my estate plan." The room became very still, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence alone, but from understanding that something significant has been introduced. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening, while Sophia remained composed, though her posture had shifted, more attentive now, more alert. "What kind of changes?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already sensed the answer would not be simple. I did not rush to respond. I allowed the moment to settle fully before continuing. "The kind that reflect my current circumstances," I said, And I held his gaze steadily, not challenging, not accusing, just stating what had become clear. The difference was not in what I said, but in how I said it, without hesitation, without the need to soften it, without the instinct to make it easier for them to hear. And in that moment I could see it, the realization beginning to form, not complete, not fully understood yet, but present, undeniable, and no longer something I needed to explain further. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than any immediate response could have, because for the first time, he was not sure how to move the conversation back into familiar territory, not sure how to guide it into something comfortable, something manageable, something that did not require him to look directly at what had been placed in front of him. Sophia was the first to adjust, as she always was, her posture straightening slightly, her expression settling into something composed, something controlled, the kind of expression that had smoothed over countless moments before, moments I had once mistaken for grace, for diplomacy, for care. "I am not sure I understand," she said, her voice even but careful, choosing each word as if testing the ground beneath it. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it, because this was not a misunderstanding, not really. "I am sure you do," I replied, my tone steady, not sharp, not defensive, just clear in a way that left little room for interpretation. I let a small pause settle before continuing, not to create tension, but to allow the weight of what I was saying to stand on its own. "For a long time I made decisions based on what I believed this family was," I said, my hands still folded neatly on the table, my posture relaxed, composed, and I did that without questioning whether those beliefs were still accurate. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his hands resting on the table now, fingers interlaced, a gesture I recognized from years of watching him think through difficult situations, except this time, he was not a child asking for guidance, and I was not the one offering it in the way I once had. "Mom, we never meant to," he began, but I raised my hand gently, not to silence him, but to pause the pattern before it could repeat itself. "I am not asking what you meant," I said, and there was no anger in my voice, only a quiet certainty that made the distinction clear. "I am looking at what happened." The room settled again, heavier this time, not with confusion, but with recognition, the kind that cannot be undone once it has been acknowledged. Sophia glanced at Daniel briefly, then back at me, her expression shifting again, more attentive now, less certain. "It was just a trip," she said, echoing the same words Daniel had used before, but they sounded different now, smaller, less effective in this setting, in this moment. "It was a decision," I replied, meeting her gaze calmly, "and it was not the only one. I did not list them. I did not need to. The pattern had already been established, and I could see in the way they both sat there that they understood it, even if they were not ready to say it out loud. I have spent years supporting this family," I continued, not as a complaint, not as a reminder meant to create guilt, but as a statement of fact, something that existed whether it was acknowledged or not. And I did that because I believed I was part of it in a way that was consistent, in a way that was mutual. Daniel looked down briefly, his jaw tightening, while Sophia remained still, her attention fixed, her composure holding, but only just. "And now?" he asked quietly, and there was something different in his voice, something less certain, less controlled. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not retreating, but settling more firmly into the position I had chosen. "And now I am making decisions based on what is real," I said, my words measured, deliberate, each one placed with intention, not on what I hoped was still true. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, complete, carrying the understanding that something fundamental had shifted, something that would not return to its previous form simply because it was more comfortable that way. The children's voices drifted faintly from another room, distant, unaware. A reminder that life continues even when its structure changes. I stood up slowly, my movements calm, unhurried, and I looked at them both one more time, not searching for a reaction, not waiting for a response, but simply acknowledging the moment as it was. "You did not forget me," I said, my voice steady, quiet, but clear enough that neither of them could miss it. "You made a choice that did not include me." I paused just long enough for the meaning to settle, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion. "So I have made my own." I turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same composed movement I had carried through everything else, and I walked out of the dining room, leaving them there, not in confusion, not in chaos, but in the stillness that comes when something has finally been said without being softened, without being adjusted, without being undone. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like I was standing outside of something I was trying to hold together. I felt like I was finally standing within something that belonged entirely to me.